Good evening. This evening, I want to talk about an incident in my personal life when I was growing up. This not very well documented in either of my two books, which were my three books, Do As to Tell books, but particularly the first or third, where you might look for some of this. Really, I haven't really didn't get into this very well, but it came up with some friends of mine and Discord group recently, and I just thought I would go over something that happened in my life because it is a little bit pertinent to the writing. And let me just go over a few illustrations first. Um, there's the house I grew up in, and you can see there's a two-car garage and porch, and the house is behind it, the kitchen and the living room, and then the bedrooms are on this side. If there had ever been an addition to the house for extra bedrooms, it probably would have built over a second floor over in this area, the way it was constructed. That never happened, but it may have been considered at one time. That house has been renovated and now is a two-story house. I won't say exactly where it is because there's a family in it, but um, that is kind of pertinent to my history. That's after a winter storm there. This is the sanctuary at the First Baptist Church in Washington D.C. in 16th and O. That's the baptistry there. Um, that's a close up of the baptistry where I was baptized with my mother in late January 1956, and the sanctuary of this building opened on Christmas Day of 1955. There's a picture of the church itself. Um, and you can see what the new church looks like. You can see what it looked like until 1955. And the pastor until the late 60s was Dr. Everett Goodwin. These are a couple of covers of his books. Interpreters needed. He talked a lot about why Christianity failed before World War II, why it let the world wars happen in his book. That's very interesting. Um, Here's something about Freemasonry. My father was a Mason, and we'll get into that in a minute. And this a couple of things of some music pins when I was taking piano, and that's a very early piano composition. The plates with the old church and then the new church as of December of Christmas 1955, and then some books. And I do happen to have um, that I have some about the Rosicrucian manual and some books from Spencer Lewis and so forth about um, the spiritual world and mysticism, karma, that kind of thing, reincarnation. Um, but yeah, I actually have a Rosicrucian manual, and I just wanted to show you that too. Um, but the thing is that that house I showed you that I grew up in was my father paid $25,000 worth of cash for it, and we moved in early October of 1949, right after I started first grade, and in Woodlawn Elementary, which is actually became a hospice now. I've shown you that before. Um, and the house next to it was owned by our builder, Gordon Johnson, and had the same floor plan as that one. They were the only two houses with that floor plan in the block, but they were kind of copies. The house was because it was already paid off. But the interesting thing is later on, when we set up my trust and when my mother, and it became a grantor trust, and I worked with lawyers and everything, and did not go through probate after my mother passed away at the end of 2010. Because there was a trust. Um, One of the things I found out through all of this is that apparently, sometime around the time that I was in fourth or fifth grade, about 2 or 3 years before the church opened, My father took out a partial mortgage on the house and made in order to contribute to the new building. Um, and that's very interesting that he did that, because I had also heard from my mother one time mention that my parents considered adopting a sister. My mother could not have any more children, and my parents considered adopting a sibling, a younger sibling, so I could learn to be responsible for a sibling. And they didn't, if it was a brother, just because my bedroom had twin beds in it. It was on the southwest side of the house, behind the garage, looking south, in other words, not where not at the backyard, looking out onto the street. A big twin beds in there. I could have put a twin brother, a brother in there, and I would have gotten used to having someone having to share my bedroom with somebody, which would have been a good lesson to learn before I went away to school when I was 18 in 1961. That would have been a good thing for me to deal with. But they didn't seem to want to consider that. Maybe I wasn't conforming enough as a boy to what was expected, not so much in intention, but in just ability, physical ability to do things boys were supposed to be able to do. I was way behind in physical strength and coordination. That might have been because of measles in 1950 when we were in Ocean City. It might have been because of some epigenetic things in the womb, because my mother had a few problems. I generally caught up with a lot of it with puberty. I tended to get more interested in particularly baseball and other things like ping pong, some other things, but softball, probably when I was 11 or 12, 10, 11 or 12 years old. We actually had a backyard baseball league we had a really big backyard, and all the yards on my side of the street were big back in the middle 50s, which I actually ran and had a little typewritten mimeographed or carbon newsletter for. So I actually had some masculine interests, I didn't really have a gender identity issue the way you hear about it today. But it was nevertheless interesting that my parents chose to give to the church and did not follow through with the idea of adopting a sibling, which apparently would have required a lot of work on the house, from what I know. But the other thing is that as I showed you, is that my father was also a Mason. And what was a little more visible was my mother was a member of Eastern Star, which is sort of a sister organization. And once a month, she would put on a white dress and go to a star meeting, which now I think the building is in Falls Church, Virginia, near I-66 and Route 29. Not too far from the Columbia Baptist Church, probably. But one night in 2008, my mother got lost driving home to that house just from this Falls Church location. It was only about probably 3 miles away or something. That was the first sign she was falling into some dementia, that she couldn't remember directions, how to get home, starting late, and she passed away in 2010. That was another interesting thing. But if my father was, the issue has come up recently with some friends about if you were a Mason, Masonry made you follow rituals and symbols and behaviors and so forth more strictly. Christianity, has so many, it has, besides Catholicism, it has so many denominations. And then each denomination generally has a liberal branch and a conservative branch, and the conservative branches tend to get into evangelicalism and be stricter about sexual morality, particularly, and were much more likely to be anti-gay in the past. That's gotten a lot more complicated recently. The First Baptist Church, and I showed you a picture of, was a member of both the American and Southern Baptist conventions, but it was always much more liberal than most Southern Baptist churches were. Even when Dr. Pruden was pastor, he preached for racial justice and for ending segregation and for the civil rights movement. He was very good about that in the 1960s. And President Jimmy Carter, taught Sunday school there a few times in the late 70s. I went to one lesson that he taught, met him. We taught about the divorce chapter and which of the Gospels, I don't remember. But I still remember that. But the question comes up, if you believe in Masonry, which gives you some strict rituals to follow. And as I mentioned, the Rosicrucian book, I actually studied Rosicrucianism a little bit back in the 1970s when I was living in New York City, and I went to the Rosicrucian New Year ceremony on the first day of spring, the vernal equinox in 1977 in New York City in a hotel. It was a misty and cold day, but I remember that. Nothing much happened it was just some rituals. There was nothing sensational about it or anything, but I remember that experience. I made some friends who were serious about belonging to the Rosicrucian order, and one of them moved out to Las Vegas later, but I kept up with. If you belong to the Masons, you sort of were likely to believe that the life of Jesus as a human being, as a man, as well as a spiritual, rather than as a trinity or what's important. Of course, Jesus had to turn back the temptations. Remember that the temptation to basically do something wrong and then go into another universe to reverse what he did to prove he had supernatural powers or something. And he turned his back and said, don't tempt me. And this temptation story, that's also very important in my life for another reason. But so somehow believing in that, and of course there are stories like Dan Brown's novel, The Da Vinci Code, and various other books that maintain that Jesus actually survived a long time after the resurrection and got married and had a lineage. And some people believe that they might be part of that lineage. That's another story. But I think the ascension, about 40 days or whatever it was after the resurrection, if I had been alive at that time and had witnessed it, that would be the most sensational thing you could witness. It would be like witnessing, I guess, a UFO abduction, something going up into the sky. And then there are other stories in the Old Testament about Ezekiel and a few of the other prophets that people say are similar to that. But to have witnessed it would be the most sensational thing you could imagine. We haven't had anything in our life. There are a lot of rumors, particularly about the Pentagon studies. And who knows, maybe Donald Trump early in his term, will validate them. I have a feeling that could happen. I have a feeling we may be on the verge of finding out something real important in the near future, in my lifetime. We might be. This President Trump might be someone who would tell us. Proxima B is interesting, even 4 light years away, but not just Mars or Venus, but maybe. We might learn something. But the story behind that movie, The Three Body Problem, on Netflix, that series, that's pretty speculative, but some of it could be true. Or something like it. I made a little short film about that myself, October 30th. It's on my channel. So my basic feeling is I don't care if another person that I am friends with, I don't care what someone's religion is. I don't care whether they believe they are saved by faith or whether they're saved by faith and works. Personally, I think you have to have the works to show you have the faith. That's quoting James, faith without works is dead. So I think works matter. I don't care if they follow the Talmud, which is very detailed in its religious rules, or whether they're claim they say they're one religion but don't follow it closely, if they're liberal about it, or if they follow the Quran, or if they follow the New Testament, the Gospels and the epistles and Revelations. I don't care whether, and the Acts for that matter. Doubting Thomas, that's an interesting story. But I don't care what they believe and what religious group they profess to belong to, or if they profess to belong to anything. They can be atheists. That doesn't affect my opinion of anyone, and I don't personally enter it. So I want to make that very clear. But I do understand that some people are perplexed by the idea that a lot of Christians, like my father, feel they need to join the Masons to do something to validate the extent to which they believe in Christ, and that it validates more the fact that Christ was a man and had a physical existence, and maybe calls into question some of the spiritual aspects of it in some people's minds. Some people find that a little bit inconsistency with faith. I don't, but some people I know do. And I just wanted to call this up. I didn't realize the significance on some people's minds of being a Mason until recently. My parents almost never talked about it. My father almost never talked about what it meant to be a Mason. But that plaque I showed you was on the panel wall above where my computers were downstairs for years. And I never really gave it a lot of thought. But maybe we can just take another look at it. That was on my basement wall for years. And I never really questioned it until recently. I started to wonder about it. So that's what I have for tonight. And it's just a personal story. And I do thank you for listening.